Well, you're all very welcome to the third week of the Story of the Story. And I think something quite intriguing is becoming evident as a sort of hypothesis that I'd like to share. In the first week, we looked at the foundation book of the Irish, Lá Gabhála, and the Book of Invasions. And what we were talking about is that the native Irish tradition of the series of invasions that started with Cessa and ended with the Tuatha Dé Danann and then the arrival of the sons of Mill, that was the native tradition. And then in the 7th century, this was cut off at the stem, and a universal mythology was inserted on top of this that was very much the Old Testament Genesis and Adam and Eve and the flood and the Tower of Babel. And what I did at the end of that was an analysis just to point out how they're two fundamentally different mythologies, just like absolutely like chalk and cheese. And then moving on a bit, by the way, that is going to be a recurring theme, and we're particularly going to pick it up next week with the Tudors, with Tom and Chowbang, because we're going to be looking at how the Tudors and Henry VIII reconnected with the Moses story in particular to create a myth, the myth of the chosen people, and that had huge implications for the Irish. So in a way, this recurring stress or I don't know whether tension really between an indigenous, more matriarchal goddess culture tradition kind of sits side by side with the very different spirit of the Old Testament. By the way, I think the New Testament is somewhere quite different if we just look at it as a mythology. Anyway, last week, what we looked at was the idea of two rhetorics. And I contrasted the Greco-Roman rhetoric, which is very much what you learn if you go to one of the privileged schools in Europe. And it's the art of debate and argument. And the way it used to work out in Trinity, where I went to university, was the bright young things in the college would be formed into two teams, and one would be for, someone would put up a motion, and some of them would be for and some would be against. And it was almost as if they didn't have any feelings about the subject matter. They could argue on either side. But that was the form of argumentation. And that was contrasted with an Anglo-Irish rhetoric, which was completely different. And it was built around story and what Kenneth Burke, the American philosopher and literary critic, calls identification. And the way that works is typically it's story-based. And the reason it works is there's a feeling of identification between the listener and the teller. And it's particularly at an emotional level. And the feeling is, you get me, you understand what I'm feeling. And particularly if it's something like shame or anger, it's particularly powerful. And I did point out that I think this form of rhetoric, I was calling it red rhetoric, was very well used, brilliantly used by a number of political figures, particularly around Brexit and the 2016 election. So the argument or the suggestion last week was that the reason Patrick was so successful in the job of so-called converting the Irish is because he had been, during his formative education years, he had completely missed out on this Greco-Roman rhetoric. And in a way, that was lucky for him, because the odds were that had he come using it, because he didn't have the support of the Roman army, the Romans never got to Ireland, so he couldn't use a force-based, power-based form of conversion. In other words, there's a sword to your neck. Do you believe this or do you not? which is a particular form of converting. So St. Patrick did not have that. So the fact that he would have been more familiar with A, the Irish myths, and B, a more story and identification perspective, and he would also have understood the Irish, which would have put him in a very good position to do a form of identification, form of rhetoric. So we have a couple of very interesting distinctions between Old Testament in Laoghaire and the ancient Irish origin story, and we have Greco-Roman rhetoric and the ancient Irish rhetoric. Now, moving on a little bit to the 5th, 6th, and 7th and 8th century, and that was a period when the Roman Empire had fallen apart, and it was the Dark Ages in Europe, and Roman civilization that was holding things together, albeit by force, had fallen apart. And there's an argument articulated in a best-selling book called How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill. And I was re-looking at that recently, and basically his argument was that the ancient Irish were very violent. They practiced human sacrifice and were very committed to slavery. And the evidence of the very violent, he quotes the Tawn a lot, and just argues that it's a manifesto for bloodletting, which is actually completely different from our experience of telling the Tawn that the takeout of it is that it's anything but a manifesto for bloodletting. It's arguably a tragic tale, not a romanticizing of bloodletting, but a critique of it. And the effect of listening to the Tawn to the end, you do not come out with Cahill's conclusion. And I think that's one of the things that's powerful about the Bard, is that what we're working with is oral tellings and including the listener. Anyway, Cahill's argument is that Patrick came along and sorted out these violent slave utilizers who are conducting human sacrifice, and his preaching the gospel sorted out Ireland. They acquired writing, and it became very successful. A form of white martyrdom white martyrdom was different from red martyrdom. Red martyrdom is the blood that flows with the Christians killed, martyred through persecution, and green martyrdom is the hermit tradition, and white martyrdom is the exile tradition in Ireland that has been a huge part of Irish history. And there's absolutely no doubt that the monks did spread throughout Europe and had a huge influence. And you go to virtually any European city and they'll point out to you a place that was very associated with the Irish education tradition. Now, I'd like to share with you a hypothesis that the success of the Irish was actually to do with the fact that their style of persuasion was not the Greco-Roman argument-based rhetoric, which they were already mostly very familiar with, but it was very much the story and identification based. And there's two things that we're going to do tonight. One is that we're going to look very closely at the Bridget story and the Bridgetine tradition, because this was hugely influential, hugely popular, And she's very interesting because she straddles both the pre-Christian and the post-Christian. And it's an illustration of how to work with a tradition and then appropriate it and make it part of a new mythology. Because what the monks would have realized that if you want to connect with a people, work with their mythology, work with their mythographics, work with their cultural stories. Basically, that I would like to suggest is what they did. They used, the monks used a style of rhetoric that was story-based, or maybe even a combination of both. But it was particularly successful in connecting with ordinary people rather than the hierarchy, because the Roman Christianity very much aligned the religious with the political. And the Roman Church was in Roman times very closely associated with those that had military and political power. Whereas the Irish monastic tradition seems to have been particularly successful in connecting with ordinary people. And at times, according to what I understand, this was of some considerable concern from the authorities who saw it as a threat. But there's one other thing that seems to me very connected with something that we were talking about in relation to Bridget, or we will be talking about in relation to Bridget, that recalls a very interesting talk that we had from the theologian Mary Condren. And she made a distinction between the Bridgetine approach, which was based on a compassion and mercy approach, as distinct from a guilt and sacrifice. And just to illustrate this, one of the reasons that the Irish church was so successful, and the Irish missionaries, is that they took the confession, which in the 5th and 6th century was a public affair. The confession was a public affair, and essentially, if you had done wrong, and done wrong in the eyes of the church, you were publicly shamed, which fits very much with Mary Condren's distinction between a Roman form of guilt and sacrifice. And what happened is that the Irish church took the confession private. So it was simply a matter of a dialogue between you and the confessor, you and the priest, that was bound by the idea of confidentiality. So this was hugely successful and hugely popular, obviously, because for ordinary people, instead of being publicly humiliated and all the fear that was associated from that, and if your sin happened the second time, you were actually excluded, excommunicated. So there would have been a lot of fear around it, whereas the Irish church seemed to adopt something that was more akin to the Bridgetine argument that Mary Condren was stressing, which is based on a theology and a practice built around compassion and mercy and private confession. So I think this is going to be picked up later by Fiona when she talks about it. But we're going to do two things tonight. We're going to have two tellings, the very different style of Bridget. And what I'd ask you to do is kind of see if you can enter into the spirit of Bridget and what it feels like, and see if you can get a sense of, through the stories and through the storytelling, of what's essentially what Mary Condren describes, as we've already said, as a mercy and compassion-based practice and theology. So let's go back to our time-honored tradition of storytelling and arguably the ancient Irish rhetoric. And initially what we're going to do is hear from Karina, and then we'll have a break and into small groups to discuss it. So I've written this up. Please see it as a hypothesis. I'd very much value any comments, any builds, any elaboration or any disagreement. If I'm effectively constructing something on fragments of it and doing myth making that's built on fake facts, I very much like to know about it. But it seemed to me, putting together a number of sources and number of bits of scholarship, a story, I think, emerges that perhaps explains why the Irish were so successful in the 5th, 6th, and 7th century, and arguably why even today they're credited with being the nation that has done more to help other nations in the world. In a recent study by, what's his name? I can't remember. Simon Anholt has done a study to share that. So maybe one way of being popular is to use ancient Irish identification, story-based rhetoric, and rather than the Greco-Roman argument and debate, point scoring. It's persuasion is a competition and an argument. Anyway, we will be taking this hypothesis forward. I have written it up, and I'll send it out to you with another table that I've done that compares the archaic, medieval, and Western forms of philosophies and mythologies. Okay, so over to Karina.